skin. But while the law prohibits anyone from selling donated organs to a hospital, those body parts called tissues can be sold. In fact, a human cadaver cut up and processed can be worth over $200,000. And the nationwide business of procuring and processing them is now estimated to be worth $500 million every year, which comes as news to many of the families who've donated those tissues with no thought of compensation and with the expectation that the tissue will go to help people who need it. People like burn victim Sadie Nolan, who after a car crash 2.5 years ago was clinging to life in a Wisconsin hospital, desperately in need of fresh human skin. Skin which, to the surprise of her mother, Kate, the hospital was having trouble finding.
They told me the night they brought her in that they would treat her if they could. They would treat her if they could find enough skin. They'd had problems in the past, and they were not sure that they'd be able to get it. At least that's what the surgeon said. Not that many people are burned badly enough to need that kind of treatment, but the ones that do use a huge amount of skin.
The hospital did eventually manage to find enough skin, but Ms. Nolan says that Sadie's injuries were just too severe.
She died 58 days later.
Though it's unlikely that Sadie Nolan would have survived her injuries, her mother could not understand why it had been so hard to find skin, especially because the hospital was just down the road from a thriving, non-profit tissue bank called Allograft Resources. But Nolan didn't know that that tissue bank had stopped providing skin to Wisconsin hospitals. So where was it going? Out of state. According to an anonymous letter to the FDA, although that tissue bank was non-profit, it was in fact being run by a for-profit human tissue company in Florida called Regeneration Technologies, RTI. And RTI was shipping that donated skin, as well as bones and veins and heart valves, to a number of for-profit companies to be transformed into high-priced medical products. And Kate Nolan was shocked to learn that one of those companies turns human skin into products that can be used for cosmetic procedures.
Let me put it to you in the simplest terms. Sadie died at UW Hospital. Her surgeon worried about getting enough skin to treat her.
Yeah.
At the same time, skin donated at the UW Hospital was sent out of state to this company that was making something that would not help my daughter. I can't imagine how indignant, how outraged she would feel about that.
Pat Peterson can. When her 18-year-old son, Zach, died, she donated his tissues to that same Allograft Resources tissue bank. What did she consent to donate?
The bones, the skin, the heart valves, everything that could be used.
Eyes.
Eyes, yes. Yes, his beautiful eyes.
Mrs. Peterson believed her son's body parts would go to save someone's life. But when she learned that they were in fact being shipped away to for-profit tissue companies...
I cried for 2 days. I couldn't stop.
You cried because?
I cried because I felt betrayed, that what actually was happening wasn't the impression I had.
But Regeneration Technologies shareholders were quite content. Their company, which is traded on NASDAQ, took in $140 million last year, making it one of the biggest tissue companies in the country. And RTI had helped create and fund that non-profit Allograft tissue bank in Wisconsin, which provided RTI with valuable body parts from donors like Zach Peterson. It was a relationship that troubled Wisconsin state legislators when they questioned Allograft CEO Nancy Holland.
The appearance of this is not seemly, shall we say. Can't you understand how this looks very inappropriate?
I can understand how it may look that way to some people.
In fact, Holland was once a vice president of RTI, and she owned almost 1 million shares of RTI stock on the day she testified. Ms. Holland refused to talk to us about it, but Bill Anderson, CEO of LifeNet, a non-profit tissue bank in Virginia, found that whole situation in Wisconsin disgusting.
When a for-profit program uses a non-profit, quote, as a front for their operations, that is, in our opinion, my opinion, not correct.
Your word was disgusting.
Disgusted, yeah. I'm trying to be nice about it.
Anderson had called us after both Nancy Holland and the American Association of Tissue Banks had refused to talk to us. And he offered to show us how he thinks a tissue bank should be run.
There are no stockholders in LifeNet, so nobody gets paid based on how many donors we do, how much work we do.
We're talking
LifeNet. I can only speak for LifeNet. In this room, we're processing skin.
Right in here?
Yes, right here. We do about 4 or 5 donors a day.
Like many nonprofit tissue banks these days, LifeNet sells tissue to hospitals. The difference, he says, is that unlike his for-profit competitors, no one at LifeNet is getting rich off the products they make from donated body parts.
Right here, for example, is a piece of tissue that comes from your hip, and that is used to fuse your spine.
It's my understanding that it's only in the middle of the 90s that this whole thing began to explode. Why?
Because tissue engineering came along.
Which meant that body parts previously of little use to doctors could be engineered into new and lucrative products. And it was then that for-profit companies came rushing in. But there was one little problem.
It's illegal to sell body parts, right?
That's what the law says, yes.
But in effect, you're selling them.
We don't look at it as selling, we look at it as providing a service.
By service, he means processing tissue into useful products. And while selling body parts is against the law, tissue businesses can charge whatever they want for the service of processing them.
The whole tissue business clings to the party line that they are not selling body parts. But they are.
We're providing a service. It's a service fee, and it does cost money to hire people, the technology, the research. The cost is what we charge. We're not really selling the tissue itself.
However you describe it, those so-called service fees begin to add up. These days, a human cadaver, cut up and processed, can be worth over $200,000 to tissue companies. But some doctors, particularly burn surgeons, worry that the dozens of new uses for human tissue mean they'll have a hard time getting the tissue they need. In fact, a survey by the American Burn Association has found burn centers nationwide were having trouble getting human skin. Dr. Ronald Tompkins was president of the American Burn Association at the time.
Half said they were having difficulties. A third of them said the difficulties were so severe that they were altering the treatment of their patients because of it.
But treating burn victims is no longer the only use for skin, for these days it can be made into products used for a wide variety of purposes, including cosmetic procedures. And doctors who perform these procedures told us that they were having no trouble getting skin.
This is the preserved, processed skin from the cadaver that's been donated.
About 100 times a year, Dr. E. Douglas Whitehead, a urologist in New York City, buys a product made from human skin, donated to tissue banks and processed by for-profit companies, and he uses it to perform penis enlargement surgery.
You have no difficulty getting the processed skin.
No.
It's available.
It's available, sure.
You don't have to delay a surgery or wait for weeks or months to get it.
No.
Though the family that donated the skin received nothing, the companies that processed and then sold it charged a sizable service fee. How much?
It's actually fairly expensive. It's approximately $2,000, so it could be $4,000 in that range.
When people consent to donate their kin's skin or tissues, do you think that they have any notion of that at the end of the line, that skin is going to be used for penile enlargement?
Well, I think implicit in your question, there is something that is negative. And I think we ought to try to change that around. They want to have a larger penis, and it can be done safely. Why not?
We asked Dr. Tompkins of the Burn Association why a tissue bank would sell skin to a for-profit company rather than to a burn center.
If you have skin and you can either sell it at cost or you can sell it at a much higher price, human nature might allow you to simply sell it at the highest price.
So they're business people.
They're business people.
Business people who keep many of their suppliers, meaning donor families, in the dark. According to Dr. Jim Oakes, who used to ask grieving families for tissue donations at the Inland Eye and Tissue Bank in California.
And they have no idea that any of this tissue is going to be an object of such commercial exploitation.
Absolutely not. Just the less you say to the family member and the less time that they are on the phone, the better for you, because they will not find this out.
Even non-profit tissue banks need money to survive, of course, and the one Dr. Oakes worked at was no exception. It got that money by sending donated body parts to tissue companies. Skin was worth almost $1,000, heart valves, $1,200, and a set of bones brought in almost $5,000 to the tissue bank.
So obviously there's a financial incentive to get as much tissue in as good shape as possible to send on to these places.
Absolutely.
The more cases you had, the more money came into the tissue bank.
That's correct.
Dr. Oakes told us he felt pressure to bring in valuable tissue, and that he even lied on at least one occasion, telling a mother that her dead son's heart would go to save a dying young man. Actually, the tissue bank sold one of her son's heart valves to a for-profit company called CryoLife for $1,200. The mother then sued the tissue bank, and Dr. Oakes is expected to testify on her behalf. The tissue bank denies that any employee has ever been under any pressure to bring in money, and says they fired Oakes as soon as his lie was discovered. With all the money that can potentially be made from donated tissue, LifeNet's Bill Anderson worries that some of the for-profit companies are giving the whole industry a bad name, which could scare away potential donors.
We're doing a lot of good for a lot of people, and I don't want to see that destroyed. I don't want to see the public confidence in the tissue industry destroyed.
I would really like to think that nobody ever had to go through 58 days of worrying because of a lack of supply of donated skin.
A footnote. The public's confidence in the tissue industry has not been helped much by a series of recent events. Last November, a young man in Minnesota died after receiving infected knee tissue from a for-profit company. The Centers for Disease Control then began a nationwide investigation, and so far they've found 25 cases of similar, though non-fatal infections in patients who'd received transplanted tissue.
Into some of the world's poorest and most corrupt nations, pushing mega power deals, projects that invariably came with huge price tags, allegations of bribery, and the weight of the United States government behind Enron. Nowhere was this more the case than in India, where Enron came in 1992 with a plan to build a massive power plant, bigger and more expensive than anywhere else. A project that turned out to be a total disaster for both Enron and India. Enron's captains came to Bombay in June of '92. They got in a helicopter and picked a site for their plant without ever landing. Within 5 days, they'd signed a deal to sell electricity to the Indian government. There had been no competitive bidding. How much did you say the contract was worth?
$60 billion over 20 years.
$60 billion over 20 years. Pradyumna Kaul is a management consultant who was brought in by Indian officials to evaluate the project. India signed this contract with no competitive bidding?
With no competitive bidding, that's right.
How do you explain that?
The Indian government in Delhi, they were told that they would have no alternative but to sign, because that was the only and the condition for the US government to continue to support India on the foreign exchange financial front.
And India needed that support back in '92. It was strapped for cash. The Americans promised to help out. Condition? India would have to open its economy to foreign investment and deregulate its heavy industries. Deregulation. That was Enron's favorite word. It offered to take India's tangled, overworked electric grid, there were brownouts in Bombay all the time, and sort it out in a flash.
They said, listen, we are going to generate electricity for you. Okay, now we are going to do it, so you don't get into this. Then we
Arrogance?
Yes, absolute arrogance. It was something which I have not seen American companies do abroad, really.
Raghu Dar is an investigative reporter and the business editor of the largest television network in India. What bothered him about the deal was that Enron had gotten the state electric company to agree to pay for the electricity Enron would produce, whether it needed it or used it or not.
You see, these are the kind of things which raised our eyebrows. These were the flags which were going up, tang, tang, you know, each one of them.
Even the World Bank was raising red flags. It refused to invest in the project and issued a report warning that the plant would be too big, the electricity too expensive. A bad deal for India, a great deal for Enron.
Enron was going to get a 25% rate of return from the project guaranteed.
Correct.
Is that unusual?
I think it's unusual for a project with essentially no commercial risk.
Professor Lou Wells of the Harvard Business School points out that Enron had persuaded the Indian government to guarantee payment of Enron's bills. That meant that even if the state electric company fell behind, Enron would always get its money.
A normal foreign investor producing light bulbs in a country takes a number of risks. How much can you sell the light bulbs for? How many light bulbs will you sell? What happens to the exchange rate? And none of these risks was being incurred by Enron.
So Enron got, if I understand you correctly, one hell of a contract.
I would say so.
And Enron had one hell of a negotiator, Rebecca Mark, the CEO of Enron International.
She was amazing. She could charm your pants off, you know.
You think Rebecca Mark wowed them?
I had this, you know, a small group of people calling me and almost breathlessly saying, Rebecca, Rebecca. Oh my God, it was amazing sight. All these people who I thought were very sensible, hardcore, hard-boiled charmers themselves.
Did she manage to charm you?
Unfortunately not, because I was looking at the electricity. I wasn't looking at...
And looking at the electricity, something very basic didn't make sense. India has a lot of coal. It had always used coal to generate its electricity. But Enron was planning to import liquefied natural gas from the Persian Gulf. This is the jetty Enron built, more than a mile long. It's where the tankers were going to dock, tankers filled with liquefied natural gas for the power plant. Why bring expensive natural gas into a country that has lots of cheap coal? Well, one of the reasons is that Enron planned to buy the gas from Enron. And the price would be determined in negotiations between Enron India and Enron's Persian Gulf division in Qatar, which was trading in natural gas.
Must have been a tough negotiation.
That's right.
Sucheta Dalal is a financial analyst and a trustee of India's largest consumer organization. She says her suspicions were raised years ago when she discovered that while Enron had offices in India, it was registered in an offshore tax haven, the island of Mauritius. She says that, in effect, Enron took India for a ride.
Sounds to me, from the way you're painting it, that the Indians were suckers.
I don't think we were just suckers. I think there's definitely a great deal of corruption.
You believe that politicians and bureaucrats were bribed by Enron?
Absolutely. Yes, I'm sure money was paid outside the country.
But you can't prove it.
Can't prove it, yeah.
Enron didn't offer editor Raghu Dar a bribe as such. He says Enron offered him a job as its corporate communications chief. Salary? $1 million a year.
You think that one of Enron's motives may have been to silence your criticism?
Yes, of course.
It was an offer he could refuse, but others must have been less stubborn. In 1995, Enron acknowledged to a congressional committee that it spent $20 million educating Indians about the power plant, an expenditure that was never explained and which apparently didn't work, at least not entirely. By the mid-1990s, a popular movement against the project was taking to the streets. In the vanguard, charging that Enron was bribing its way through India, was this man, Gopinath Munde. It's a charge Enron has denied, but Monday promised voters of the state where the plant was being built that if elected, he would throw Enron into the Arabian Sea.
Enron was a big issue in your election campaign. You were against Enron?
Definitely.
Monday won the election, and he was good to his word. As soon as he took office, he halted construction of the plant, which put Enron in such a panic that Rebecca Mark and Enron chairman Kenneth Lay screamed back to India to pile on the pressure. The American ambassador, Frank Wisner, pitched in. His role, as he saw it,
was to try to convince the central government to back a resumption of the project and to convince the state government that it was in its best interests to put the project back on track.
He would come up and plead that if India does not go along with Enron's proposal, then foreign investment and capital flows into the countries would dry up completely. He said it not once, number of times.
Isn't it an American ambassador's job to drum up business for American corporations?
Yeah, but that's not what Wisner did. There were other American corporations which were coming into India, but the only company and the only project which Wisner supported was Enron.
Frank Wisner and Rebecca Mark succeeded. They convinced Monday to uncancel the project. Rebecca Mark's reward, a multi-million-dollar bonus. Wisner, soon after he retired from government service in 1997, he took a job as director of an Enron subsidiary.
When someone comes from business into government and goes back into business, that can hardly be a surprise. When someone has a career in government and then suddenly goes into business where that business was closely related to his career, I think people's eyebrows inevitably get raised.
Were there any raised eyebrows when this happened?
Mr. Simon, I really take exception and disagree with the premise of the question. There have been hundreds of government officials, including presidents and secretaries of state, who've joined private companies after leaving their offices.
But the question remains, how did Wisner and Rebecca Mark convince Gopinath Monday, the man who'd promised to throw Enron into the sea, to change his mind?
Did anyone from Enron ever try to bribe you, sir?
No.
You think Enron was bribing Indian officials?
No.
So you now say that you don't think Indian politicians took bribes, but when you were running for office, you made a point of saying that the previous government was taking bribes.
I said that, and I said that we should cancel the project, and I canceled it. Then, because I canceled it, it was renegotiated.
Renegotiated? Not only did Monday agree to resume building the plant, he agreed to triple its size. The Indians were now contractually bound to buy 3 times more power, again, whether they needed it or used it or not. Enron had always admitted that their electricity would cost a little more, but in 1999, when the giant plant came online,
the first electricity bill was approximately 4 times what we were paying for our power. How can it be 4 times more? And if we had it right long ago, then that obviously means that Enron was lying all along.
last year, India's state electric company simply couldn't afford to pay Enron's bills anymore. The Enron plant shut down. With Enron's share price tumbling, Kenneth Lay became desperate. He demanded a $1 billion bailout from India's central government and threatened U.S. economic sanctions, a total cutoff of American aid and assistance to India.
I don't know of any country where a corporate house can threaten sanctions against a sovereign nation.
But Lay had always found solid support from Washington, and it was no different now. The Bush administration set up an Enron task force. Objective? Make those Indians pay their bill. Vice President Cheney did his part, as recorded last June, in his task force email. Good news, it reads. The Veep mentioned Enron in his meeting with Sonia Gandhi, the Indian opposition leader. But then, a few months later, Enron lay bankrupt and disgraced, and the administration was in the midst of its war on terror. India was a key player there, so one would have thought that U.S. officials would stop trying to squeeze the Indians on Enron. But just listen to what U.S. Ambassador Robert Blackwell said just 2 months ago.
I hear a frequent buzz from the United States that the sanctity of contract here may now be in doubt, a concern that can spell death to potential investments.
Why should the problems of this one power project in India be so important that in the middle, it's post-September 11th, you're in the middle of a war with Afghanistan, and India is discussing terrorism, and in the middle of that, they're slipping in this little bit about trying to give Enron its $1 billion.
To us, at the end of the day, it was one of the worst sides of American corporate culture we saw.
America let you down.
Yes, and it was sad, to be very honest. To be very honest, we felt sad because we expected amazing standards.
Rebecca Mark, who was Enron's CEO in India, left the company in 2000, selling her shares for $79 million. She's back in Houston now, and she declined to speak with us.
Hey guys, I got someone here who wants to meet you.
A dog!
A dog?
A dog.
But you told them we couldn't get a dog until we got the house. Did you hear something from our lender?
We got the house.
Call the Fannie Mae Foundation for a free guide to help put you on the path to home ownership and for a list of lenders and credit counselors.
When it comes to allergies, we're both pollen, cat, dust. But her allergy medicine was only approved for the pollen. So my doctor switched me to hers. She's always copying. Why would I keep an allergy medicine not approved for all my allergies?
Most people with allergies have both indoor allergies